There is a moment in every person's life when the ground beneath them simply disappears. No warning. No countdown. No chance to brace. 1 second the world is solid. The next second it is not. And in that split second, everything you thought you knew about yourself, about who you are, about what kind of person you have become, about how your story began, gets rewritten completely. This is a story about one of those moments. But the twist, and there is a twist in this story that I promise you have never seen coming, is that the moment did not happen to the person you might expect. It did not happen to the woman who deserved better. It did not happen to the mother standing in the hospital corridor with red eyes and shaking hands. It happened to the man who caused all of it. The man who set the whole chain of events in motion on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when he decided that a pregnant woman mopping a hallway floor was an inconvenience he had every right to scream at. Think about the last time someone made you feel like you did not matter. Think about how small that made you feel. Think about how long you carried that. Now multiply that feeling by 100. Now imagine you are 7 months pregnant, standing alone in a high-rise corridor at 7 in the morning, holding a mop, having done absolutely nothing wrong, and a man in a $3,000 suit is pointing his finger in your face and telling you that you are the problem. That your body is the problem. That your baby is the problem. That is where this story begins. And I need you to stay with it, all the way through, because what this story becomes in the final act is something that no writer could have invented. The truth, as it turned out, was so much more devastating, so much more precise in its cruelty and its justice, that the only way to describe what happened next is to say that life itself was watching that morning. And life does not forget. My name is not important. What I am about to tell you is. This is the story of a man we will call Everett Cole. And this is the story of a young woman named Maya Washington. And this is the story of a secret that had been buried for 26 years beneath the weight of ambition, cowardice, and the kind of quiet selfishness that men like Everett Cole have always mistaken for strength. By the time it all came out, a baby was gone. A young woman's world was shattered. And a powerful man was sitting on a plastic hospital chair holding a bunch of white lilies, finally understanding what it means to lose something you never even knew you had. Stay with me. Every single word of what follows is worth your time. To understand what happened on that Tuesday morning in March, you first have to understand who Everett Cole was. Not who he told people he was. Not the version of himself that appeared on the cover of business publications or delivered keynote addresses at industry conferences. You have to understand the real architecture of the man, where he came from, what he built, and more importantly, what he left behind along the way in his rush to get to the top. Everett Cole was 53 years old at the time this story takes place. He had been born and raised in a small working-class suburb just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. His father worked in manufacturing, and his mother took in alterations from a sewing machine she kept in the spare bedroom. They were not poor in the way that makes headlines, but they were the kind of poor that is invisible, the kind where you always have shoes, but they are never quite the right size, where there is always food, but never quite enough of it, where every month is a small negotiation between what you need and what you can afford. Everett had grown up watching his parents work themselves to exhaustion and receive almost nothing for it, and he had made a decision very early in his life, quietly, the way the most important decisions are always made, that he would never be in that position. He would never sit at a kitchen table balancing a checkbook with a pencil. He would never look at a bill and feel his stomach tighten. He would get out of Cleveland. He would build something. He would make sure that no one could ever look at him the way the world had looked at his parents, with that particular brand of indifference that the comfortable reserve for the struggling. And to his credit, or at least to the credit of his discipline and his intelligence, he did exactly that. He earned a full scholarship to Ohio State, studied business and finance, graduated near the top of his class, and spent his 20s accumulating experience in corporate financial consulting with the same quiet ferocity he had brought to everything since childhood. By his early 30s he had co-founded a technology services company called Colevantage Solutions with a business school acquaintance named David Park. The company specialized in enterprise software implementation and compliance systems, not glamorous, not the kind of thing that makes for interesting dinner conversation, but extraordinarily profitable in an era when large corporations were scrambling to digitize their operations and desperately needed people who understood both the technology and the regulatory landscape. Colevantage grew steadily for 8 years and then, when the market conditions were exactly right, it exploded. By the time Everett was 44, the company had over 900 employees, offices in 6 cities, and a valuation that made the Cleveland kid with the 2 small shoes a genuinely wealthy man. He took the company partially public at 47. He moved the headquarters to Chicago. He bought a building downtown, a glass tower on Michigan Avenue that the architectural press called ambitious and that Everett called, privately, proof. Proof that he had done it. Proof that he had become exactly what he had decided to become at the kitchen table in suburban Cleveland all those years ago. He married a woman named Sandra at 31. Sandra was a corporate attorney from a Philadelphia family, educated, composed, and in possession of a kind of steady elegance that Everett found deeply attractive in part because it was everything he had not grown up with. They had been married for 22 years by the time this story takes place. The marriage was, by any external measure, solid. They were good at the public version of their partnership. They attended the right events together. They hosted dinner parties where the food was catered and the wine was very good, and the conversation stayed safely on the surface. They respected each other. They were, in the way of many long-married couples who have stopped expecting surprise from one another, comfortable. What they did not have was children. They had tried in the early years of their marriage. Sandra had wanted children with an ache that she had never fully been able to articulate to Everett, perhaps because Everett had received the news from the fertility specialist with a composure that left no room for her to fall apart in. The specialist had been clear. A condition on Everett's side made biological fatherhood essentially impossible. There were options, the doctor said. There were paths forward if they wanted to pursue them. Everett had nodded, asked a few precise questions about the medical specifics, thanked the doctor for his time, and walked out of the clinic and straight into the next item on his calendar. Sandra had sat in the car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before she could drive. They never adopted. Everett did not want to, though he never said so directly. He said the timing was never right. He said the business demanded too much of him. He said perhaps later, and later became another year, and eventually Sandra stopped bringing it up because the silence around the subject had become too heavy to keep lifting. They filled the space where children might have been with the business, and the travel, and the charity galas, and the house in Michigan they never had enough time to use properly. They were not unhappy. They were simply 2 people who had learned to live inside the shape of their actual life rather than the one they had once imagined. That is the version of Everett Cole that Chicago knew. That is the version his board of directors knew. That is the version that sat in the corner office on the 40th floor of the Colevantage building every morning, reviewing reports, and taking calls, and making decisions with the quiet authority of a man who had built something real and knew it. But there was another version. A version that existed in a different city, in a different decade, in a summer that Everett had spent almost 26 years convincing himself he had completely moved past. That version involved a woman named Renee. And that is where the story truly begins. In the summer of 1997, Everett Cole was 27 years old, and had been sent to Austin, Texas on a 6-month consulting contract with a mid-sized technology firm that needed help restructuring its financial reporting systems. He was young, ambitious, and living out of a furnished corporate apartment near the University of Texas campus. He worked long hours during the week. On weekends, he allowed himself to exist in the way that young men in their 20s do when they are far from home and temporarily free from the weight of their own future, loosely, without agenda, following whatever conversation or street or invitation presented itself. He met Renee Washington at a 4th of July cookout hosted by a mutual friend in East Austin. The gathering was in a backyard strung with lights in the way of East Austin backyards that summer, loud with laughter, heavy with the smell of food on the grill, the kind of neighborhood gathering that feels like a photograph of community even while you are living inside it. Renee was 25. She had grown up in East Austin, in one of the historically black neighborhoods that the city had not yet fully gentrified away, and she carried that upbringing the way people who come from places with deep roots carry it, in her ease, in her directness, in the specific confidence of someone who knows exactly where she comes from and has never been ashamed of it. She was working as a hospital administrative coordinator, and she had the kind of warmth that fills a room without demanding anything from it. She laughed loudly and without self-consciousness. She argued about music, R&B, soul, the precise lineage of gospel into funk into hip-hop, with the authority of someone who had been raised inside that tradition. She cooked extraordinarily well and seemed genuinely embarrassed when people complimented her on it, which only made them compliment her more. Everett was drawn to her immediately and completely, which surprised him, because he was not at that point in his life a person who was easily surprised by anything. He had always kept his emotional architecture very tidy. He knew what he wanted from work, what he wanted from relationships, what he wanted from the decade ahead of him, and he moved toward all of those things with the methodical precision of a man who distrusted accident. Renee disrupted that precision without even trying. She was simply herself, entirely and without apology, and Everett found himself spending that entire July evening talking to her about things he had not talked about with anyone: his father's hands, rough and cracked from the manufacturing floor. The specific sound of his mother's sewing machine late at night. The particular quality of hunger that is not about food. They spent the rest of that summer together. 3 months of weekends and late evenings and long drives out to the Texas Hill Country on Saturday mornings when neither of them had anywhere to be. It was not a serious relationship, in the way that the most serious relationships of your life are always somehow described as not serious at the time, because seriousness would have required a future, and Everett had a future already drawn up and Austin was not in it. Chicago was. The company he was going to build was. The life he had been engineering since he was a kid sitting at that kitchen table in Cleveland was. Renee was present tense, and Everett had always been most comfortable in the future. When his contract ended in late September, he packed his apartment in 2 days. He told Renee he would call. He told her the distance was manageable, that they would figure it out, that he was not the kind of man who just walked away. He told her all of those things with genuine conviction, because in the moment he said them, he believed every word. He drove to the airport. He boarded his flight. He went home to Chicago. He allowed the weeks to fold into months, and the calls he had promised to make became voicemails he did not leave, and then they became nothing at all. He told himself she would be fine. He told himself it had been a summer thing, beautiful and temporary, the way summer things are. He moved on the way driven men in their 20s move on, completely, without looking back, because looking back slows you down. He never once considered that Renee might have something to tell him. He never considered it because he never gave her the chance. The number he had left her went to a phone he canceled 2 months after moving back. The email address was replaced. He changed apartments. He was, within a year, an entirely different chapter of his own life, and Renee and Austin, and that backyard strung with lights was a closed book on a high shelf, and if he thought of it at all it was with a kind of warm, sealed-off fondness that asked nothing of him. What Everett Cole did not know, what he would not know for 26 years, was that Renee Washington had found out she was pregnant 3 weeks after he left. That she had written him 2 letters and deleted them both. That she had found his new Chicago address through a mutual friend and written a 3rd, and mailed it and waited. That when the weeks passed and the letter went unanswered, she understood what his silence meant. That she had made the decision, alone, in her apartment in East Austin on a Tuesday night in November of 1997, that she would raise this baby without him. Not because she was angry, though she had every right to be. But because she was not going to spend her child's entire life making them feel like a problem that needed to be solved. She named the baby Maya. She raised her in Austin with the help of her mother, and her sister, and her church community, and the particular fierce love of black women, who have always known how to build something solid out of the materials they actually have, because that knowledge has been passed down through generations of women who were given very little and made something extraordinary from it anyway. She worked hard. She was present. She told Maya the truth about her father when Maya was 16, not a cruel truth, not a detailed inventory of grievances, but a simple one, that her father was a man named Everett who had chosen a different life, and that Renee had chosen not to chase him, and that Maya was the best decision Renee had ever made and the only one that had ever mattered. Maya had listened carefully. She had asked 2 questions. She had cried once, briefly. And then she had gone back to her life, the way teenagers do, the way people do when they are given an honest answer and find that the honest answer, while hard, is something they can actually carry. She never searched for him. He was an absence that had always been there, and she had long since learned to live around it. She did not know, at 26 years old, that she was mopping a floor in his building. By the time Maya Washington was 26, she had already lived more than most people do by 35. That is not a compliment to anyone. It is simply a fact about what it means to be a young black woman of modest means in a country that charges extravagantly for the basic architecture of a decent life, health insurance, housing, childcare, the kind of stability that people with money take for granted and people without money spend every waking hour trying to construct from scratch. Maya had moved from Austin to Chicago when she was 23, following a boyfriend whose plans had seemed more stable than they turned out to be. When that relationship ended, 18 months in, she was left in a city she did not grow up in, with a part-time administrative job that did not cover her rent, and a stubbornness that had always been her most reliable character trait. She did not go home. She had never been the kind of person who went home. She found a cheaper apartment. She found a second job. She enrolled in evening accounting classes at a community college, paying for them 1 course at a time, because she had a plan, and the plan required credentials she did not yet have. The accounting classes were slow going on a budget that allowed for almost nothing extra. When the cleaning job came up through a staffing agency, commercial cleaning for a company called Brightspace Solutions, contracted to maintain several downtown high-rises, she took it without hesitation. It paid $14 an hour and it came with something that, at 7 months pregnant, was worth more than the hourly wage, full health insurance. That was not a small thing. That was the thing. Medical care for a pregnant woman without insurance in the United States can cost tens of thousands of dollars. With insurance, it was manageable. The cleaning job made it manageable. The baby's father was a man named Deshaun. He had been kind when they first got together and increasingly less kind as the relationship progressed, which is a pattern that Maya had not recognized while she was inside it because she was 25, and in love and hope is a very effective blindfold. When she told him she was pregnant, and that she intended to keep the baby, he told her he needed time to think. He had been thinking, by the time this story takes place, for 4 months. She had not heard from him in 6 weeks. She had stopped waiting. She was not devastated by his absence. She was tired. There is an important difference. Devastation implies surprise. Maya had stopped being surprised by the ways that men could make themselves small in the precise moments that called for them to be large. She had her mother's voice on the phone every evening. She had a best friend named Jasmine who drove down from Waukegan every other weekend with food and company and the specific kind of humor that only best friends who have known you long enough can get away with. She had her own plans, her own will, her own particular brand of forward motion that had gotten her out of every difficult corner she had ever been backed into. She also had, at 7 months pregnant, ankles that swelled by midday, a lower back that ached from the 3rd hour of her shift onward, and a cart that weighed 40 pounds fully loaded. She pushed it to work every morning and she did her job and she did it correctly, and she told herself, the way that people in the middle of something hard always tell themselves, that it was temporary. That the accounting certificate would come. That the better job would come. That she was building something, one shift at a time, and the building would be worth it. She had decided to name the baby Lily. She had not told many people yet. It felt private, a small, warm secret she carried with her through the cold corridors of the office buildings she cleaned at 5:30 in the morning when the city was still dark and the elevators opened onto empty floors, and she was, for a few hours, the only person in 40 stories of glass and steel. She liked that part, actually. The quiet. The sense of the city holding its breath before the day began. She had a habit of talking softly to Lily during those early morning shifts. Nothing dramatic, just narration, the way you might describe a walk to a child riding in a stroller. There's the corner office. Someone left their coffee mug again. The view from up here is something else, baby girl. One day we're going to have a view like this for real. On the morning of Tuesday, March 12th, Maya was assigned to the 40th floor of the Cole Vantage building on Michigan Avenue. It was a floor she had cleaned before. She knew the layout, knew which offices generated the most paper waste, knew that the executive corridor near the elevator bank dried faster if you mopped it from the east end. She was, in every meaningful sense, a professional doing a job she knew how to do. She arrived at the floor at 7:22 in the morning. She set up her cart at the service entrance. She began the corridor closest to the elevator bank, the one that led directly to the executive suites. She placed her wet floor warning signs at both ends of the damp section, as protocol required, two bright yellow stands, clearly visible, positioned exactly as her supervisor had trained her to position them. She had never once had an incident on this floor. She had never had an incident on any floor. She was careful. She was methodical. She was 7 months pregnant and she was careful. Everett Cole's calendar that Tuesday showed a 9 o'clock start time. He had a board prep call at 9:30 and a site visit at 11. He had no reason to be in the building at 7:45 in the morning. No one had told Maya to expect him. No one had told anyone because no one knew. He had woken at 5, been unable to sleep, and decided to get ahead of his emails. He was in the car by 6:30, at his desk by 7:15, and walking down the executive corridor toward the small kitchen at the end of the hall at 7:44, looking at his phone, moving fast, the way he always moved, the way men who believe their time is worth more than everyone else's time always move. He did not see the wet floor sign until his left foot hit the damp section of the floor and skidded 2 inches to the right. He grabbed the wall. He did not fall. His coffee, however, went in a wide arc across the floor and down his jacket. And Everett Cole, who had not been inconvenienced in any meaningful sense, who had not been injured, who had not been harmed by anything except his own inattention, turned around and found Maya standing 12 feet away holding a mop, and his reaction to what he saw was the kind of reaction that tells you everything you will ever need to know about a person's character. What Everett Cole did in that corridor lasted less than 3 minutes. The building's security camera captured all of it. We know from the accounts of 3 people who later reviewed that footage, a building manager named Howard, a member of the internal HR team, and Everett's own head of legal, that what happened was not ambiguous. There was no gray area. There was no version of events in which what Everett Cole did could be characterized as proportionate, reasonable, or remotely defensible. He walked toward Maya. He stopped approximately 4 feet in front of her. He pointed at the floor. He pointed at the wet floor sign, which he had clearly not seen before he stepped onto the damp section, which was the entire point of the wet floor sign, to warn people who were not looking. He told her she was a liability. He told her in a voice that the building manager later described as raised and aggressive, that she had no business being in that section of the floor. He said, and again, this is on camera, that she should have more sense than to be working in her condition. He said that word. Condition. As if her pregnancy was a personal choice she had made with the specific intention of inconveniencing him on a Tuesday morning. Maya did not raise her voice. Every account of what happened and the footage itself confirmed that she remained calm. She told him quietly that the warning signs were placed correctly and had been clearly visible. She told him she was sorry he had startled himself. She used those words deliberately, sorry he had startled himself, because she was making a point without making a scene, which is the specific skill that women in service jobs develop when they work in environments where making a scene has consequences that men like Everett Cole never have to worry about. He told her he was going to call her supervisor. He told her he was going to call Brightspace Solutions and have her assignment to this building reviewed. He said the word reviewed in the specific tone that powerful people use when they mean terminated. He told her that if she could not do her job without creating a hazard, she should not be doing her job at all. He walked away. He did not look back. He walked into his office and he closed the door. Maya stood in the corridor. The building manager Howard would later describe finding her there, and what he described was not a woman who was visibly crying or visibly upset in the way that people expect distress to look. She was very still, he said. She had both hands over her stomach. She was pale. And this was the word he used, and it stayed with him, very far away. Like she was there but not quite there at the same time. Her body had already begun the process that her mind was still trying to process. The spike in blood pressure that comes with acute psychological stress. The surge of cortisol and adrenaline that are the body's automatic response to a perceived threat, a response that, in a woman in her third trimester of pregnancy, carries consequences that are not theoretical. Research published by the National Institutes of Health has found that acute psychological stress significantly raises the risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes. A meta-analysis of studies covering over 35,000 women found that 1 in 3 women who experience significant stress during late pregnancy will show measurable effects on their blood pressure within hours. In a high-risk third trimester situation, that is not a statistic. That is a countdown. Howard found her 7 minutes after Everett had walked away. By that point she was sitting on the floor next to her cart. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. She had simply sat down because her legs had stopped cooperating. She was breathing in a way that Howard recognized from a first aid training he had done the previous year as hyperventilation, fast, shallow, uncontrolled. He called for an ambulance from his radio, and he sat down on the floor next to her, and he held her hand, and he told her it was going to be okay. He would later say, in a statement that was included in the subsequent legal proceedings, that he told her it was going to be okay because he did not know what else to say, and because he needed her to hold on, and because the alternative, admitting in that moment that he did not know if it was going to be okay, was something he could not bring himself to do. The paramedics arrived at 7:59. Maya had lost consciousness by 7:56. The emergency team assessed her quickly, noted the late-stage pregnancy, the dangerously elevated blood pressure, and made the call to transport immediately. The ambulance left the Cole Vantage building at 8:03 in the morning. Howard stood on the sidewalk and watched it go, and then he went back inside, and he sat in his office, and he did not move for a long time. In his office on the 40th floor, Everett Cole was on a conference call. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial worked quickly, and with the complete focus that emergency obstetric situations demand. Maya was assessed, stabilized to the degree that was possible, and taken into an emergency procedure within minutes of arriving. The medical team knew what they were dealing with, a pregnancy at 31 weeks in crisis, a mother whose blood pressure had spiked to a level that put both her and the baby in immediate danger, a body that had been pushed past the threshold that it could hold. The details of what happened in that room belong to Maya and to Maya alone, and they are not mine to lay out in clinical sequence as if they were case study material. What I will tell you is what the outcome was, because the outcome is the thing that everything that follows hinges on. The outcome is the thing that you cannot explain away, cannot minimize, cannot file under regrettable circumstances and move on from. Maya lost the baby. Lily. The little girl she had been talking to on quiet mornings in the empty offices of a building that belonged to a man she had never met. The little girl whose name she had chosen because it was her grandmother's name, and because it meant something pure and bright and forward-looking, the way that the names people give their children always carry the weight of the life the parent hopes to give them. Lily was gone. 31 weeks. A little over 7 months. Far enough along that she had been fully formed, fully real, with fingernails and eyelashes and a heartbeat that Maya had seen on the ultrasound screen 2 weeks earlier, small and fierce and absolutely certain. Renee Washington got the call from the hospital at 9:15 in the morning. She was in Austin. She booked a flight that left at 11:40. She landed in Chicago at 2:30 in the afternoon, and took a cab directly from O'Hare to Northwestern Memorial, and she walked into her daughter's hospital room, and she did not say anything for a long time. She just sat in the chair beside the bed, and she held Maya's hand. That is a particular kind of love, the kind that does not reach for words because words are inadequate, because the thing that has happened is beyond the register of language, because the only honest response to a grief this size is simply to be present in it. Renee Washington had been showing up for Maya her entire life with that particular kind of love. She did not stop now. Meanwhile, in his office on the 40th floor, Everett Cole was discovering that the morning had become significantly more complicated than a wet jacket and a ruined coffee. His head of legal, a woman named Claire Hendricks, had been briefed by building management at 8:45. She had reviewed the preliminary security footage report. She had been told about the ambulance. She had been told about the pregnancy. She had spent 30 minutes consulting with outside counsel before she knocked on Everett's door, closed it behind her, sat down in the chair across from his desk, and told him what she knew. Claire Hendricks had been with Cole Vantage for 9 years. In 9 years she had handled employment disputes, vendor litigation, regulatory audits, a whistleblower complaint that could have ended the company if she had not managed it with absolute precision. She was not a person who alarmed easily. She was alarmed now. She told him the facts without editorializing. The pregnant cleaning contractor had collapsed on the 40th floor approximately 40 minutes after their interaction. She had been transported by ambulance. The pregnancy had been at 31 weeks. The hospital had not yet confirmed outcomes, but initial reports from the paramedics and building staff were serious. The security camera footage was intact, and had been reviewed by at least 4 people in the building. 2 people had already posted on social media about seeing the ambulance at the Cole Vantage building. 1 had tagged the building's Instagram account directly. The Brightspace Solutions HR line had received 3 calls. Everett's assistant had received 1. She told him that this had the potential to become a legal and reputational crisis of significant proportions if it was not addressed immediately and personally. She told him that in her professional judgment, the appropriate response was not a statement. It was not a settlement offer through intermediaries. It was him. In person. At the hospital. Everett sat behind his desk for a long moment. Then he asked what he should bring. Claire told him flowers were appropriate. He took his car. He stopped at the hospital gift shop on his way in, and bought the first flowers he saw, white lilies, wrapped in cellophane, sitting in the front row of the display as if they had been waiting for him. He did not notice what they were. He was thinking about the legal exposure. He was thinking about the statement his communications team would need to draft. He was thinking about the board call he was going to have to make before this hit the press. He was not thinking about Renee. He had not thought about Renee in years. He was about to be given no choice. Everett arrived at the maternity emergency ward at 3:45 in the afternoon. The nurse at the desk told him that Ms. Washington was resting and not accepting visitors. He said he understood. He said he would wait. He sat down on one of the plastic chairs in the corridor, this man whose office had 2 Eames chairs and a view of Lake Michigan, and he held the cellophane-wrapped lilies in his lap and he waited. He had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when the door to Maya's room opened and a woman came out. She was carrying a polystyrene cup of hospital coffee, and she was looking down at her phone, and she came very close to walking directly into him before she looked up. She was in her early 50s. Natural hair worn close and neat, graying at the edges the way that beautiful things gray, not as a loss but as evidence. She had on a blue cardigan over a printed blouse, the kind of put-together that is not about money but about pride, the specific care of a woman who believes that how you carry yourself still matters even on the worst days of your life. She looked like someone who had been awake for a very long time, and was holding herself together through the specific determination of a person who has decided that falling apart is not an option right now. She stopped. Everett stood up, the way he had been raised to stand when someone entered a room, a reflex from his mother's training that had survived every other transformation he had undergone. And then something happened to him that he had not experienced since he was a young man. Something moved through him that was completely outside his control. Something old and layered and attached to a part of his life he had long since closed. He knew her face. Not from a meeting, not from an event, not from any context in the life he currently lived. From somewhere deeper than that. From a backyard in Austin strung with lights in the summer of 1997. From 3 months of Saturdays in the Texas Hill Country. From the sound of a woman laughing loudly and without self-consciousness at a 4th of July cookout 26 years ago. He watched it happen on her face too, the moment of recognition arriving in stages, the way very old memories surface, not all at once but in fragments that assemble themselves into certainty. He watched her eyes change. He watched her understand. She said his name. Not a question. A fact. He said hers. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere further down the hall a monitor was beeping steadily. Someone was speaking in a low voice behind a curtain. The ordinary sounds of a hospital afternoon moved around them while 26 years collapsed into a single moment between two people standing 4 feet apart in a hallway with nowhere to go. Renee looked at the flowers in his hand. She looked at his face. Everett Cole, who had made it his life's work to be unreadable, to present only the composed and deliberate surface of a man who had everything under control, felt something happen to his face that he was unable to stop. She saw it. He knew she saw it. She said, "You don't know." He said, "Know what?" She said, "Maya is your daughter, Everett." He heard the words. That part happened quickly. The hearing. The individual words arriving in sequence, each one processed at the basic level of language. But the understanding, the full-dimensional understanding of what those words meant when they were placed next to everything else that had happened that day, when they were placed next to the ambulance and the empty corridor and the woman on the floor and the baby named Lily who was no longer alive, that understanding did not come quickly. It came the way a tide comes in. First at the edges. A gradual cold. Then further up. Then all the way through. The woman he had screamed at that morning was his daughter. The baby who had not survived was his grandchild. The name on the flowers, Lily, was the name Maya had chosen for the baby girl she had lost. He sat back down on the plastic chair. He sat there for a long time. Renee stood in the corridor and did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that the moment had not already said for her. Eventually she went back into the room. The door closed quietly behind her. And Everett Cole sat in the hallway of a hospital on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a bunch of white lilies, and for the first time in his adult life he was completely, entirely still. Renee came back out 30 minutes later. Maya had fallen asleep. Renee had a second cup of coffee. She had gone back to the machine at the end of the hall, and she sat in the chair next to Everett's and she told him what he needed to know. She told it the way someone tells a story they have told in their own head 1,000 times, in the middle of the night, when the children are asleep, and the house is quiet, and there is nothing to do but finally, fully feel the weight of the choices that other people made and the life that grew from them anyway. She told him about the pregnancy. About the letters she had written and not sent. About the one she had mailed and that had gone unanswered. She told him about the decision she had made in November of 1997, alone, in her apartment, with the television on low and the particular silence of a woman who has just understood that she is going to do this by herself and has decided to be at peace with it. She told him about raising Maya in Austin. About her mother's help, her sister's help, the church community that had never asked for anything except that you show up and be real, and not pretend that life was easier than it was. She told him about the years of watching her daughter grow into someone extraordinary against every odd that had been stacked against her from the beginning. She told him that she was not angry. She said this clearly and directly, the way she said everything. She had been angry for a long time, she admitted, but anger is an expensive thing to maintain over 26 years, and Renee was a practical woman who had never been able to afford things that cost too much and gave too little back. What she felt now, she said, was something more like the specific exhaustion of a person who has carried a heavy thing for a very long time, and has finally been allowed to set it down, not because the carrying is over, but because the person she was carrying it from has finally shown up. She told him that Maya knew the broad facts about her father. That she had told her at 16. That Maya had asked 2 questions, cried once, and moved on with the particular pragmatic grace that Renee had always found both heartbreaking and deeply impressive in her daughter. She told him that Maya had never searched for him. Not because she did not have questions, but because she had answered them herself, in the way that children of absent fathers ultimately do, by deciding that the absence says more about the person who left than about the person left behind. She told him that if he was sitting in this corridor for legal reasons, for liability management, for the purpose of protecting his company and his reputation, he should leave. That she would not stop him, and that Maya would never know he had been there, and that they could all proceed with whatever professional and legal process was appropriate, and never have to sit in this corridor together again. She said this without cruelty, but also without softness. It was simply information. She told him that if he was sitting in this corridor as something other than that, as a human being who had just learned something enormous, and was trying to figure out what kind of person he was going to be now that he knew it, then that was a different conversation. And it was a conversation that she could not have for him, and that his lawyers could not have for him, and that his communications team could not have for him. It was a conversation that he would have to find a way to have with Maya, in Maya's time, on Maya's terms, if she ever decided she wanted to have it at all. She told him that Maya had lost a baby today. That the baby's name had been Lily. That Maya had been planning for this child with the same fierce, organized love that she brought to everything, buying things from thrift stores and sales and storing them in boxes under her bed in her small apartment on the north side of Chicago. That whatever else was true about this day, whatever revelations it held, whatever it meant for Everett's life, or Renee's sense of closure, or the long arc of choices made in an Austin backyard 26 years ago, today was Maya's grief. And Maya's grief was the only thing that mattered right now. Then she stood up. She straightened her cardigan. She picked up her coffee. And she told him one more thing, quietly, before she went back into the room. She said, "The wet floor signs were placed correctly, Everett. She did everything right." Then she closed the door. Everett sat in the corridor for another hour. He did not call anyone. He did not check his phone. He did not think about the board call, or the communications team, or the legal exposure. He sat with what he had done, and what he had not done, and the 26 years of distance between those two things, and for the first time in his adult life he allowed himself to simply be inside the full weight of it without looking for the exit. The days that followed were not clean. Real life never is. There were no dramatic gestures, no sweeping declarations, no sudden transformations of character that tend to happen in the films that stories like this eventually become. What there was instead, was a series of slow, uncomfortable, necessary things happening one at a time in the unglamorous way that actual change always happens, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of choices made after that moment, when the feeling of revelation has faded and all that is left is the question of what you are actually going to do. Everett told Sandra that evening. They sat in the kitchen of their house in Lincoln Park, not the living room, not the formal dining room, but the kitchen, the most honest room in any house, and he told her everything. About Renee. About Austin. About the summer of 1997. About the letter he had never answered. About Maya. About what had happened that morning in the corridor of his own building. About Lily. About the lilies. The conversation lasted for hours. It was not easy. It contained things that Sandra had not known, and things she had suspected without ever quite articulating even to herself, the way that long-married people accumulate unspoken knowledge about each other. There were stretches of silence that lasted long enough to be their own kind of speech. At the end of it, Sandra asked him one question. She asked what he intended to do. He told her, honestly, that he did not know yet. She nodded. She said that was, at least, an honest answer. She did not leave. That deserves to be said clearly, Sandra did not leave. She stayed because she was that kind of person, and because she understood, perhaps better than Everett did at that moment, that the work of being a human being is not finished when you know the truth. It begins there. He hired a private DNA testing service. Not to build a legal case, but because he needed to know with certainty before he took any step that could affect Maya's life, and because asking Maya to take a test before she had agreed to any relationship with him would have been another form of entitlement he was trying very hard to stop practicing. Renee agreed to provide a sample on Maya's behalf, explaining to Maya only that she wanted to have confirmation in writing before anything else was decided. The results came back in 6 days. The probability of paternity was 99.97%. Maya Washington was Everett Cole's biological daughter. He instructed his attorneys to establish a financial support arrangement that was not contingent on any relationship between himself and Maya, not a transaction, not a negotiation, just a straightforward transfer of resources to a young woman who was rebuilding her life after a loss that he had caused, regardless of what she decided she wanted from him going forward. He arranged for her legal fees to be covered. He called the CEO of Brightspace Solutions personally, not to negotiate, but to ensure that Maya's position, with full benefits, would be held for her for as long as she needed, and that her record would reflect nothing negative from the incident. He wrote her a letter. It took him for drafts over 3 nights. He did not write it on company letterhead. He wrote it by hand on plain paper, sitting at the kitchen table in Lincoln Park, the same kind of kitchen table he had sat at as a child in Cleveland, watching his parents balance their numbers and wondering how to build something better. He did not ask for forgiveness in the letter. He understood that forgiveness was not his to ask for. He said what he had done. He said what he had not done. He said what he knew now. He said that whatever she decided to do with the letter, whether she read it or didn't, whether she ever wanted to speak to him or never did, he wanted her to know that she had not been abandoned because she was not worth staying for. She had been abandoned because he had not yet become the person who was capable of staying. And that the difference between those two things was the only thing he had left to offer her. Maya did not read the letter for 3 weeks. It sat on her kitchen counter in its envelope. Jasmine asked about it once and Maya said she was not ready. Jasmine did not ask again, because that is what it means to be a best friend to someone in grief, you follow their timeline, not yours. When Maya finally opened it, she read it twice. Then she called her mother. Then she sat with it for another day. Then she called the number at the bottom of the page. The first call lasted 11 minutes. There were long silences on both ends. Neither of them said very much. At the end, before she hung up, Maya said, "I don't forgive you. I want you to know that. But I'm not going to pretend, I don't want to know who you are." He said that was more than he deserved. She said yes. It is. The call ended. He sat at the kitchen table in Lincoln Park for a long time after. Sandra brought him coffee. He held it without drinking it. Outside the window, Chicago went about its evening, the traffic, the lights, the sound of a city that does not stop for anyone's revelation, that keeps moving at exactly the same pace regardless of what is being understood or decided in the kitchens and corridors and hospital waiting rooms hidden inside it. 3 months later, Maya agreed to meet him. A coffee shop in Wicker Park, a neighborhood she liked and he had never been to. She brought Renee. Not as a mediator, but because she wanted her mother there, and because the presence of Renee was the clearest possible statement of what this conversation was and was not. It was not a reconciliation, it was not a reunion, it was not the beginning of a family drama with a happy resolution. It was two adults who shared DNA and nothing else, sitting down to see if there was anything worth building from that fact, slowly, on Maya's terms, without pressure and without performance. Everett arrived 10 minutes early. He ordered nothing until they came. When he saw them walk through the door together, Maya moving carefully, still healing in ways that were not visible, still carrying a grief that she had refused to let define her even as it was still very much with her, and Renee steady behind her, the way she had always been steady, something happened in his chest that he would later find very difficult to describe. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was something closer to reckoning, the specific feeling of finally being inside the consequences of your choices, fully and without insulation, and finding that the consequences are real people who are still standing. They talked for 2 hours. No one cried. No one made promises. No one drew up a plan for what happened next. They talked about ordinary things and difficult things, and some things that had no category at all. At the end, when they stood up to leave, Maya looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Same time next month if you want." He said yes. "I want to be very careful about what I say here, because this story is one that can be cheapened very easily if you let it become something it is not. It is not a redemption story in the comfortable sense of that word, the sense where a person does something terrible, and then learns a lesson, and becomes better and everything resolves into a satisfying shape. Life does not work that way. Harm does not work that way. A baby named Lily did not survive, and no amount of personal growth on the part of the man responsible for the circumstances of that loss changes that fact or earns anything back from it. What this story is, if it is anything, is a story about the consequences of living without accountability. Everett Cole spent 26 years building an empire, and in the process became the kind of man who believed that his time, his comfort, and his irritation were more important than the dignity of the people around him. He became the man in the corridor. He became the man who pointed his finger at a pregnant woman doing her job correctly, and told her that her existence was an inconvenience. He became that man slowly, over years, through the accumulation of small choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation, and were collectively catastrophic. And the reckoning that came for him was not divine. It was not karma in the cosmic sense. It was simply reality, moving at its own pace, indifferent to his calendar. The 26-year-old woman he screamed at was his daughter. The baby she lost was his grandchild. The yellow wet floor sign she had placed correctly was sitting 6 feet from where he stood. Everything that happened that morning happened because Everett Cole was not paying attention. Not to the sign. Not to the woman. Not to the life he had already touched and walked away from before she was born. Research from the National Institutes of Health tells us that women who experience acute psychological stress in late pregnancy face significantly elevated risk of adverse outcomes. A comprehensive meta-analysis found that psychological stress during pregnancy raises the risk of pregnancy loss by up to 42%. Workplace stress alone raises it by 27%. These are not abstract numbers. These are lives. These are lilies. These are Tuesday mornings in the corridors of buildings where powerful men are looking at their phones, and women, who are building something from nothing, are doing everything right. Maya Washington is not a symbol. She is not a lesson. She is a person who lost her daughter on a day when everything that went wrong was caused by a combination of one man's cruelty and one society's indifference to the conditions it creates for the most vulnerable people doing the most necessary work. She did not deserve what happened to her. She was not redeemed by it. She was injured by it and she continued anyway, and the continuing is not the lesson, the injury is. The lesson, if there is one, belongs to Everett. And it is not the lesson of discovery, not the twist that reveals something about the universe's sense of irony. The lesson is simpler and older than that. It is the lesson that every single one of us who has ever treated someone as invisible, who has ever walked past a person doing a difficult job without acknowledging them, who has ever let impatience override basic decency, it is the lesson we have all had available to us the whole time, no twist required. The people around us are fully formed. They have names and histories and children they are talking to softly on quiet Tuesday mornings. They deserve to be seen. They deserve the basic courtesy that we extend automatically to people who look like us and forget entirely when they do not. Maya is rebuilding. She went back to her accounting classes. She is still in Chicago. She still talks to Jasmine every day and to her mother every evening. She and Everett have met 6 times now. The meetings are still careful. The ground between them is still new and untested and neither of them quite knows where it leads. But she shows up. And he shows up. And that, the showing up, the willingness to sit in the discomfort of a relationship that has no template and no guarantee, is the only honest thing left to do. Somewhere in this city tonight, Maya Washington is making a plan. For the accounting certificate. For the better apartment. For the next chapter of a life that was interrupted in the worst possible way, and is being rebuilt anyway, because that is who she has always been. She inherited that from her mother. She did not get it from her father. She built it herself, the way she has always built everything, from the materials she actually had, with the people who actually stayed. If this story moved you, I need you to carry it forward. Not as content. As awareness. The next time you walk past someone doing a job that makes your life easier, look up. Say good morning. See them. It costs you nothing. To them, it is everything. Thank you for staying until the end. I will see you in the next one.